Hey, this is Shah with the podcast Thrive and Not Survive After Child Abuse. Yeah, doing it from home. It's been a while ago since I just did it from behind my desk. Did it is meaning recording the podcast. Yesterday we had a good session with some people on Zoom and Facebook Live. I've posted here on this podcast about the imposter syndrome, right? And how many professionals and successful people actually struggle with the imposter syndrome, and that you actually could set yourself up for an imposter syndrome as well. And there was this case of one of the people that was listening to us, and you can actually listen back to that how we talked about it. But in the case, if you took all your courage together and you wanted to start a podcast like I do, and then after a few episodes, you really start to wonder, and because there's no one listening, or maybe one or two listeners, and then you start to wonder, like, no one wants to listen to me. I'm just not good enough. Who wants to listen to my story? All that kind of stuff, right? So that can come up really quickly, right? And then you start to think that you're not good enough for it, right? So it could also be the other way around. If you start to be very successful and you get a lot of good reactions after your first posting your first episode, then you might think like, oh, that must be luck, right? No, I'm not that interesting to listen to about anyhow. So this extra voice in you, actually, that is actually what we call the imposter syndrome. And you are not a fraud, actually, because you are struggling with these thoughts. Real frauds, they don't struggle with these thoughts, right? They just want to scam you, so they want to be fraudulous, so they don't struggle with this, right? The fact that you are struggling with this is maybe the ultimate proof that you are not a fraud, that it is just your internal thought. And like I said, the thought is not your thought, is just a thought, it's not a fact, right? But one question came up today is how do sexual abuse victims deal with the imposter syndrome? Well, I have to say this. In the case of sexual abuse victims, um, it could be in many cases exactly the same as with anyone else, but here's an extra layer to it, right? Abuse victims in general already struggle with being authentic and being themselves, right? Because in my case, and if specifically if we talk about child abuse victims, in my case, I was, violently taken sexually by much older men when I was 7, and that went until I was 12. So I kept a lot of these things a secret. So I started to live some sort of a weird other life. So I didn't dare to express myself in the way how I wanted to express myself. So in the case of me, I'm a very extroverted person, actually, that if most people that know me would not say that I led a very introverted life as a young kid, because I kept everything for myself. And you see, you create this some sort of a alter ego, maybe almost, which then that is not you. I was reading like tons of books, and no, I still like to read, by the way, but maybe I would have handled these things kind of slightly different. It was a weird thing, right? So specifically, the fact that I was more extrovert, I was way more drawn to, the more arts thing, the dancing thing already, and I just took that on way later. But I developed a more factual approach, very pragmatic, very conformistic to anything. I really wanted to listen to authority because I was so afraid to do something wrong, because something wrong in my case often meant punishment, right? Because the way how I was brought up. So to find your authentic self back as a sexual abuse victim is already hard as it is. So we deal a lot with symptoms that are either very close or completely the same as what we call the imposter syndrome. So that is, it was a good question actually to ask, how do sexual abuse victims deal with it. So I would almost say they deal with it from the very beginning. They struggle with it. They know that they don't express themselves the way they feel that they truly are. Often, sexual abuse victims becomes very inward focused, right? There's nothing wrong with being inward focused, but most people actually are kind of more extroverted than they do. There are only, from a psychological point of view, there are only very few people on this planet Earth that are truly, truly introverted. But circumstances can make you very introverted and can make you be afraid to express yourself the way you truly are, which is, part of being part of suffering from that imposter syndrome, right? Fear makes you do that. It doesn't make you come out the way you believe you actually are, or makes you believe that you are that, but that's, what I wanted to say, of that you truly are. So I started to develop things that I always have to do something right, or I have to do something according to certain rules and stuff like that. It took me a while that's not the case at all. Specifically not in art form like dances. Yeah, there are some rules maybe if you want to do a competition, but there's way more freedom, and you should take way more freedom that there is in any art form. But basically are no rules, right? It's kind of like, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt someone else, mentally or physically. But if you want to do like me, I just chose for an art form that is also done in a competitive style, how weird that may sound if you've never heard of competitive dancing. So then you abide to certain rules, but they are, pretty broadly formulated. So to find those, what I always say, the edges of the cadres of the rules that are bound by something, right? And if you can push a little bit where those boundaries are, I think that's a very healthy way to develop yourself. But that's not how I wanted to play it. That's maybe how I wanted to play it, but that's definitely not how I dared to play it, because when I was younger, anything that I did, at least that's what I believe, was always punished by something. And I was, by my abuser, very held to some, almost like a strict, prison or handcuffs almost, is I called it the shackles. And the shackles kept me somewhere in the middle of anything. So I started to lead a very safe and non-risking type of life, and that is so really against my more, own character, my authentic character. I start to feel that much better when I grew up. When I became older, I have to say, not when I grew up. When I became older, in my late 20s and early 90s, I started to when I late 20s, yeah, and early 30s. I'm just having my numbers all wrong here. I started to discover that I felt a lot for dance, and I was very drawn to emotional expression and how that worked. And it was not until I came across one of my most influential teachers, and his name is Ruud Vermeij, when I came to him and started to learn about emotional expressions, and that you can express whatever you want, not only what you feel, but maybe also it's a way to express what kind of emotions there are out there in the world. And I didn't know a lot about these things. Basically, in my family, at least that's how I felt it. I hope I don't insult any of my siblings or family members with this, but it felt like we basically knew only two kinds of emotions. It was either happy or we were angry or something like that, right? So we flip flopped really from one extreme to the other. So we were like happy, and then the next moment it could be really like a war zone in the house where we were throwing stuff and yelling, and it was like crazy. I felt very unsafe with that, and not to add anything to that craziness. I know that one of my other siblings was the same thing, who started to be very quiet and very inward focused. And there's many more nuances to express when you get a little bit upset than becoming really angry. And I must honestly admit that I have to be very alert when something happens to me that upsets me, that I don't immediately fall in the category of anger. And an art form like dance helped me truly to that, to find that authentic self. So yesterday I talked about the imposter syndrome and how to deal with this. And maybe one thing that I could add actually through that is, start doing something like dance or another art form, because it brings you more freedom in expressing the way you truly feel you are, and that actually helps you overcome these things quite effectively, I must say. So this was Shah with another episode of the podcast Thrive Not Survive after child abuse. This time it was like, let's say, the second episode around the imposter syndrome, with a little bit more focus on abuse victims and abuse survivors. So hope to hear you back tomorrow. It's tomorrow will be the last day of the year, at least if you listen to my podcast on the day that it is recorded. If not, then just to kind of know when I recorded it. All right, I'll say with this, bye bye.